In June of 1774, a short novel was anonymously published entitled Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Almost immediately, this book started what came to be called a fever, the Verter effect. Soon, the book was translated into almost every European language. It sparked creative responses from other writers and artists who wrote their own plays, poems, and even operas about the story. But the obsession would only grow. As early as 1776, fanatics of the novel visited the grave of the man on whom the story was partially based, Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem. They led a procession there by torchlight, sang one of the popular poems inspired by the story, and left flowers upon the grave. Michael Holz writes in the introduction to his English translation, quote, "At the Prater in Vienna, there was a Werther fireworks display. In Fleet Street in London, Mrs. Salmon's Royal Historical Waxwork showed the, quote, much admired group of the death of Werther. Werther songs were sung. Meissen porcelain showed Werther scenes. Ladies wore Werther jewelry, and their scent was Eau de Werther. They carried Werther fans and wore Werther gloves. By 1799, Werther had gone round the world and was returning to Germany from the Far East. An enterprising Chinese, noticing the popularity of the character, had begun producing Werther paintings in the Chinese style and sending them to Europe." End quote. The fanaticism for the story was met by a fair share of criticism, and for reasons that will become obvious, The Sorrows of Young Werther was controversial from the very beginning. There were disapproving reviews alongside the rave reviews. There were dismissive remarks from intellectuals who were less than impressed with the novel. What's more, the main character chooses to end his life at the climax of the tale. The Werther effect did not only include an enthusiasm for the character in his story, but troublingly a desire to imitate him. It became popular to dress in the character's blue frock coat and buff waistcoat. Werther was to become the model for the passionate man of a romantic temperament, an archetype that appealed to many young people of the era and probably appeals to young people from every era. But what came with this, at least allegedly, was a romanticization of Werther's depression, and the book was blamed for creating copycats who did not just wish to emulate Werther's manner of living, but his manner of dying. Whether or not this is true remains debatable, and for my part, the premise that a book could cause someone to take their own life is somewhat suspect. Nevertheless, the theological faculty at Leipzig recommended to the city that they ban the book for this very reason, and the city agreed and imposed one. It was banned in the countries of Denmark, Austria, and Italy. In many ways, we may recognize several aspects of Werther fever that are familiar in the modern day. Werther was a trend, a meme, a force in the zeitgeist that took the culture by storm. Like most trends that catch fire in this way, Werther appealed to the youth, probably in no small part because it was seen as dangerous by the older generations. But there is one effect of Werther fever that is rarely replicated, in that this book captured the heart of a man who would go on to have a dramatic effect on European history. When he was a cadet at the military academy in Paris, a young Napoleon Bonaparte first read The Sorrows of Young Werther. The year was 1787, and Napoleon was 18 years old. By all accounts, he was every bit the young romantic as the typical imitators of Werther. In the late 1780s, seemingly inspired by the book, he attempted to write his own romantic tales, full of similar themes. In 1795, Napoleon met Josephine, a woman he would fall deeply in love with and would marry the following year. He would eventually make her the Empress of his new France, though it is well known that their relationship was every bit as turbulent as it was passionate. To put it bluntly, neither of them seemed to be able to stop themselves from cheating on the other one. Napoleon repeatedly turned to the pages of Werther during this time, perhaps to understand himself and his romantic travails. The same year he met Josephine, Napoleon authored an homage to the book entitled Clisson et Eugénie. Fittingly, the main character is not a young artist, but a soldier, who falls madly in love with a woman and marries her. But his wife is unfaithful to him, and rather than taking his own life by traditional means, he leads a hopeless charge in battle and throws himself into the enemy lines. When it comes to the fever that surrounded the Sorrows of Young Werther, life imitated art. With Napoleon's homage to Werther, art imitated life. While Napoleon was away on his Italian campaign, he would quote from Werther in letters to Josephine while she cheated on him with Hippolyte Charles. After discovering Josephine's affair, Napoleon's own infidelities only increased. In 1798, during his Egyptian campaign, Napoleon began an affair with Pauline Forez, who was called his Cleopatra. While in Egypt, he brought along the Sorrows of Young Werther as part of his personal library, during which he reread the book 7 times. It is therefore no understatement to say that this is perhaps the most important work of fiction for understanding the inner life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Its words accompanied him throughout his political adventures and personal turmoil, and thus it is no surprise that when Napoleon conquered Prussia in 1806, bringing it under the control of his new empire, he soon desired to meet its author. The authorship of Verter had not remained anonymous for very long. By this time, its writer was well known, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Most of us in the English-speaking world know Goethe today as the writer of Faust, his magnum opus, and one of the great classics of European literature. Werther was a product of Goethe's youth, a work of Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, that reflected the volatile and obsessive emotions of youth, the power of romantic feelings to elevate a young man's soul up to the heavens or plunge him into a kind of hell. Goethe would far transcend this style of writing, authoring philosophy, travelogues, tragedies, comedies, a scientific treatise. And he wrote so many poems that, in the words of Hollingdale, Goethe threatened to literally exhaust the capacities of the German language. This is all to say that by the time Napoleon summoned Goethe to meet him at the Congress of Erfurt in 1808, Goethe had long since become much more than merely the author of The Sorrows of Young Werther. And yet for Napoleon, the topic of discussion that interested him during their meeting was, of course, his favorite book. The Congress of Erfurt was formally a conference between the French and Russian empires, and part of Napoleon's effort to strengthen his alliance with the Russians in order to maintain his continental system, in order to break the power of the British and make himself ruler of all Europe. But this was by no means merely a political meeting. Napoleon wished to show the ascendancy of the French culture under his reign, and dazzle not only the Tsar, but his German subjects. He selected a number of French plays to be performed, including his favorite actors in the dramas. Dignitaries and nobles from all over Europe attended. As part of this display of French cultural power, key figures in literature and the arts were invited to meet Napoleon, and it was against this backdrop that Goethe was summoned to the governor's palace at Erfurt. Goethe's statements on Napoleon are mostly positive, even though Napoleon's soldiers entered Goethe's home during the sack of Weimar, an event during which many of Goethe's friends lost everything. Goethe accepted Napoleon as a legitimate successor to the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire. It should be stressed that many of the artists and intellectuals of this time also fell under Napoleon's spell, and Goethe's favorable view of Napoleon was by no means unusual. Goethe in particular saw Napoleon as a kind of artist of statecraft. He would later tell Eckermann during one of their conversations in 1828, quote, "That divine enlightenment, whence everything proceeds, we shall always find in connection with youth and productiveness, as in the case of Napoleon, who was one of the most productive men who ever lived. Yes, my good friend, one need not write poems and plays to be productive. There is also a productiveness of deeds, which in many cases stands an important degree higher." End quote. Later that same year, he praised Napoleon in terms which are even more laudatory. Quote, "Napoleon was the man. always enlightened, always clear and decided, and endowed with sufficient energy to carry into effect whatever he considered advantageous and necessary. His life was the stride of a demigod, from battle to battle, and from victory to victory. It might well be said of him that he was found in a state of continual enlightenment. On this account, his destiny was more brilliant than any the world had seen before him, or perhaps will ever see after him." End quote. It seems that the two men were destined to meet as mutual admirers, perhaps because each man lived an opposite sort of life, which nevertheless happened to exemplify the virtues that his counterpart exalted above else. What I mean by this is that Goethe is a man full of constant activity, who sees no value in works that do nothing to spur one on to living more fully. A poem or a philosophical work ought to, above all, inspire. And, on the other hand, he had no patience for idle philosophical speculation or for works of art that make one languid or unenergetic. He told Eckermann, quote, "Genius is not genius without the enduring power to inspire productivity in others. It makes no difference what business, art, or profession one pursues. It's all the same. Whether one proves to be a genius in science, like Aachen and Humboldt, or in war and public administration, like Frederick, Peter the Great, and Napoleon, or whether one writes a song, like Berenger, it is all one, and the only thing that matters is whether the thought, the insight, the deed is alive and has the capacity to live on." End quote. To oversimplify Goethe's attitude, we could see the telos of art as being the inspiration of deeds, leading people to a productivity of deeds. And thus it is that oftentimes, as he says, men of deeds like Napoleon can stand a considerable degree higher in their value than those who simply write plays and poems. And meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte, the archetypal man of action, was consumed in his personal life by tumultuous emotions and tried his own hand at immortalizing these feelings into art. But no one had better given voice to these feelings than Goethe himself. And thus, in spite of whatever military or political accomplishments he attained, Goethe represented Napoleon's own role model in the domain of artistic activity. After their meeting, during which the two discussed the Sorrows of Young Werther, Napoleon met with Goethe again at Weimar, along with the writer Christoph Martin Wieland, and arranged for them both to be awarded the Cross of the Legion of Honor. It is difficult to construe this act as a merely cynical attempt to appropriate the German culture for the French Empire's prestige. Napoleon's obsession with Werther was simply too central to his life for us to believe that. And thus the military man decks the poet with high honors. The two would never meet again after 1808. In recent years, the popularity of Werther has returned in a strange way, and that is the meme of the sensitive young man. While it is not my habit to reference timely things on this show, and to generally avoid commenting on popular trends or memes, I am fascinated by this particular case, quite independently of the current moment or any of the timely political implications. If you have not encountered this meme, it's not terribly difficult to understand. Werther has been referenced from the very beginnings of the meme's virality. I think we can primarily understand the type of person that is conveyed by the meme by reference to the Sorrows of Young Werther. Now, this type could also be explained by reference to other writers such as Stendhal, but Werther remains the prototype. Werther is the type that we will study for the precise reason that we have, in effect, a sensitive young man in the figure of Napoleon, who's directly influenced by this book. The life of Napoleon is, in so many words, the blueprint for those who share these memes, but that in itself presents a kind of riddle, because after all, in the life of the fictional character, Werther, and the life of Napoleon, we have two very different stories. Werther is consumed by his passions and ends his own life. Napoleon, on the other hand, conquers much of Europe before his eventual defeat. Whatever went on in his personal life, or within him, Napoleon's model is not typically understood as that of the sensitive romantic. We don't usually associate the reign of Caesarian strongmen with sensitivity, nor do we associate the pining lover with autocratic ambitions. And thus we may ask, what is it that links the sensitive type to the Napoleonic type? Not just as regards the current moment, but in the figure of Bonaparte himself, who's a case study for the sensitive young man turned Caesar. In order to understand this, we have to first approach the text itself. But to do that, we have to become familiar with its background. Werther is usually considered a work that is equal parts biographical and autobiographical because Goethe wrote the story by weaving together his own experience with young and unrequited love with that of Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem. Both men lived in Wetzlar in 1772. Goethe at a law internship at the imperial court, and Jerusalem as a secretary to an ambassador. Both fell victim to unrequited romantic feelings while in Wetzlar. But while Goethe accepted the situation, left town, and went on to have an illustrious career, Jerusalem killed himself a few months after Goethe's departure. Goethe learned the details of Jerusalem's death and incorporated them into the novel, and The Sorrows of Young Werther was born. In effect, Goethe could instill the character with real feeling by drawing on what he himself had felt, but give the character a climactic and tragic end by concluding his story as Jerusalem's had concluded. First, we'll consider Goethe's experience. Goethe spent a total of 4 months in Wetzlar. There, by happenstance, he met a young woman, Charlotte Buff, at a ball, and the two became fast friends. Charlotte was the kind of woman who inspired happiness in all around her, and Goethe was no exception. He described her as a cheerful, pleasing, and pure soul, and that wherever she was, quote, an atmosphere of light-hearted serenity prevailed, end quote. However, she was already intended to marry Christian Kästner, thus forbidding any romance between the two of them. Goethe had great affection for Charlotte, and though there is no evidence that there was anything inappropriate about their relationship, that affection was far greater than a mere friendly affection. Goethe wrote of her, quote, if, as they say, the greatest happiness is to be found in longing, and if true longing must always be directed to something unattainable, then everything conspired to make the youth whose fortunes we are following the happiest mortal on earth, end quote. The youth he refers to in the third person there is, of course, himself, his younger self. And in the passages that follow, he suggests that his longing for Charlotte was used productively, that he channeled it into his artistic output. In spite of Goethe's feelings for Kästner's intended, Goethe and Kästner seemed to like one another. Goethe considered Kästner a diligent and sensible man, and Kästner wrote of Goethe as a true genius, with many exceptional talents. He said he had, quote, an extraordinarily vivid imagination, which leads him to express himself mostly in images and parables, end quote. All three spent a great deal of time together, though Kästner was often called away by business, leaving Goethe and Charlotte to spend time alone. The town and the surrounding countryside provided an idyllic setting that Goethe remembered fondly. By all accounts, Goethe was less interested in making valuable social connections than he was in wandering the countryside and sleeping under linden trees, conversing with friends or with the local villagers, and taking long walks with Charlotte. He was practically obsessed with Homer at this time. Kästner wrote, upon meeting Goethe, quote, he has come at his father's wish to look for a practice, but he himself inclines more to perusal of Homer, Pindar, etc., and whatever else his genius, his way of thinking, and his heart move him to, end quote. Alas, this idyll was soon to end. In spite of the fact that Kästner was not a jealous man and Goethe bore no ill will towards him, the tensions that arose in their friendship seem all but inevitable. Kästner wrote in his diary of Goethe, quote, "He loves her, and however much of a philosopher he is, and however well disposed he may be towards me, he does not care to see me coming to pass my time in pleasure with my girl. And I, though I too am well disposed towards him, do not like to find him alone with my girl, entertaining her." End quote. Eventually, Charlotte felt compelled to tell Goethe that she could never return his love, which Goethe accepted. Goethe spent a final evening with the couple, during which Charlotte raised the topic of life after death, and whether it was possible that souls could be reunited in another life. Goethe then left Wetzlar the next morning. Kästner says that Charlotte had tears in her eyes as she read his letter announcing his sudden departure. In the letter, Goethe wrote, quote, "I will leave you both to your happiness, and will not be gone from your hearts." End quote. Goethe remained in contact with Charlotte and Christian Kästner, however, and soon after his departure, he learned of the story of Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem. Goethe seems to have been fascinated with Jerusalem, and he wrote to Kästner to ask for more details. In his letter to Kästner, Goethe recalled what he knew of the man. Quote, "The poor fellow! I remember returning from a walk and meeting him in the moonlight and saying to myself, 'He is in love.' It was loneliness, God knows, that ate away at his heart." End quote. Goethe had often crossed paths with Jerusalem many times over the years, but scarcely knew him. In his autobiography, Dichtung und Wahrheit, Goethe recalled Jerusalem's appearance. Quote, "He wore the clothes that were usual, in imitation of the English in northern Germany, a blue frock coat, a buff leather waistcoat, and breeches." End quote. Obviously, this would become the iconic look of young Werther that would be imitated over and over again. Christian Kästner helped to fill in the details, elaborating on what Goethe already knew in rough outline. Apparently, Jerusalem was in love with Elizabeth Hurd, another man's wife. She did not return his affections and asked her husband to forbid him from their home, which he did. Jerusalem had apparently also been largely excluded from high society. He was known to take long walks at night, which was when Goethe had seen him around town. He was an alienated and solitary individual, consumed by passionate love for a woman he could not have. He had a rather low opinion of Goethe. He referred to him as a fop and a scribbler. In spite of this apparent antipathy, Goethe could see within Jerusalem that same obsessive feeling that he himself had experienced, as the young man's tragic end attested. After being rebuked by Elizabeth Hurd, he wrote to Kästner, asking him to borrow 2 pistols, for he would soon be going on a journey. He then had a servant bring him a bottle of wine. He wrote 2 letters for certain, one to his family and one to Hurd, apologizing for disturbing the peace of his home. Kästner speculated that Jerusalem may have written a 3rd letter to the ambassador, which may have been suppressed, such that it appeared that unrequited love was the sole cause of his mental state. In fact, the ambassador was displeased with Jerusalem and wanted him replaced. Kästner speculated that the ambassador just didn't want to be blamed for contributing to Jerusalem's mental and emotional collapse. Whatever the truth may be, Jerusalem then shot himself sometime around midnight. He did not die, at least not immediately. He was found 6 hours later in a pool of his own blood, having thrashed about the office in great agony, and now unable to do much but groan. He finally departed the world around noon. Goethe wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther 2 years later. It took him only 4 weeks. For him, the work represented an exorcism of the storm and stress of youth. He spoke of a sense of freedom and deliverance that he attained after the work was done. Werther is as much a character modeled after Jerusalem as Goethe himself, and yet he referred to the book as his confession. Of course, after a good confession, a weight is lifted, or at least that's what we hope for in a confession, even if it isn't necessarily always the case. Some have interpreted Werther as a kind of simulacrum of Goethe. By killing Werther, this fictional stand-in for himself, Goethe, the real man, can go on living. Indeed, troubled by the rumors of Werther copycats, Goethe affixed a postscript to subsequent editions, reading, quote, "Be a man and do not follow me," end quote. In other words, the point of the story was never to glorify nor to defend the act of taking one's own life, as Jerusalem himself had done in an essay. In spite of, however, the religious and moral authorities interpreted the work, for Goethe, Werther was a literary catharsis. It was a purging of these violent feelings through artistic means, after which he could move on with his life. He scarcely could have realized how Werther fever would sweep Europe in a few short years. Many young people found that this story about unrequited love resonated with them, and it seemed that there was much more to the story, therefore, than merely the expurgation of Goethe's violent passions. So, with this background, let's now dive into the work itself. The story is told primarily through letters sent by Werther to his friend Wilhelm, and to his unrequited love Charlotte, to her husband Albert. There's also a section toward the end of the novel that is told through third-person omniscient narration, which is attributed to an editor. Werther comes to the fictional town of Valheim, which obviously bears strong resemblance to Wetzlar, and like Goethe, he spends his time in nature, talking to townspeople, taking long walks, attempting to draw, to illustrate the countryside. Among his first impressions of the people in Valheim, we get our first insights into the kind of character that Werther is, why it is insufficient to understand his sensitivity as wholly pertaining to romantic feelings. Werther is a man apart. He has a kind of cynicism about the human race that is common to young people, particularly those who are disillusioned and particularly those who are depressed. He says, quote, "If you ask how the people are here, I have to answer, just as they are everywhere. The human race is a monotonous affair. Most people spend the greatest part of their time working in order to live, and what little freedom remains so fills them with fear that they seek out any and every means to be rid of it. What a thing our human destiny is! But the folk are of a very fine kind. When at times I forget myself, and together with them enjoy the pleasures that are still available to mankind, such as sitting round a crowded table, joking in innocent, open-hearted warmth, or taking a ride, or dancing when one feels like it, or such things, it has a very good effect on me. But then I must be certain not to think of those many other powers lying dormant in me, mouldering in disuse, which I must needs keep carefully concealed. Ah, it trammels the whole heart so, and still to be misunderstood is my fate." End quote. So, on the one hand, we might notice a contradiction of sorts. Werther tells us that people are the same everywhere, and yet he also says the folk here are of a very fine kind. And I think this contradiction is central to his character. In the latter paragraph we read from, he expresses the joy he feels while spending time with this community. And yet he also feels he's destined to be misunderstood. He decries the monotonous destiny of humanity. He simultaneously judges the social life of those around him, and yet he yearns to be a part of it. He sees himself as better than the common folk, but he envies their ability to live simply and take enjoyment from simple pleasures. Oh, if I could only be one of these ordinary people who can be happy rather than, every instance of happiness reminding me how I'm disusing the powers available to me or something like that. My inner genius or my inner worth that is not, that's going to waste while just enjoying the simple pleasures of mankind. This contradictory desire to be with others and apart from them, I think, is one of the best examples is in the play No Exit by Sartre. Hell is other people. And we have to remember that in the context of the play, this statement is, well, it's a rather literal one in the context of the play, but it's also a conflicted one. The protagonists can neither stand to be with one another nor to leave. We might also remember Nietzsche's offhand remark that his entire philosophy totters after an afternoon spent in good company and conversation with other human beings. Nietzsche was being a bit tongue-in-cheek there, but he's expressing a real paradox of human life, or really a paradox that particularly afflicts artists and intellectuals. Nietzsche extols the virtues of solitude and argues that the pursuit of truth requires you to transgress against the ideas of the collective. In other words, the philosopher, Nietzsche's own type, he conceives as essentially set apart from others, and he eschewed the Hegelian account of mankind as a creature seeking mutual recognition. Nietzsche attributed such a desire only to the herd. He wrote instead to the extraordinary individual who gives vent to his own peculiar form of genius, something that comes out of his own depths. And yet, even Nietzsche feels the pull of the social life. The simple joy of sharing a conversation with a few friends in his philosophy is suddenly on shaky ground. Werther elaborates on these philosophical musings in a subsequent letter. Quote, "That the life of man is but a dream has been sensed by many a one, and I too am never free of the feeling. When I consider the restrictions that are placed on the active, inquiring energies of man, when I see that all our efforts have no other result than to satisfy needs which in turn serve no purpose but to prolong our wretched existence, and then see that all our reassurance concerning the particular questions we probe is no more than a dreamy resignation, since all we are doing is to paint our prison walls with colorful figures and bright views, all of this, Wilhelm, leaves me silent. I withdraw into myself and discover a world, albeit a notional world of dark desire, rather than one of actuality and vital strength." End quote. Further down he continues, quote, "I gladly confess that they are the happiest who, like children, live for the present moment, drag their dolls around and dress and undress them, and watchfully steal by the drawer where Mama has locked away the cake, and when at last they get their hands on what they want, devour it with their cheeks crammed full and cry more. They are happy creatures. And those others who give pompous titles to their beggarly pursuits and even to their passions, and chalk them up as vast enterprises for the good and well-being of mankind, they too are happy. It is all very well for those who can be like that." End quote. Of course, Werther believes that he can never be like this. He can never be a simple person living for day-to-day pleasures, living for the moment. Nor can he give a pompous title to his pursuits and passions. He goes on to say that all he can do is draw into himself, create a world within himself, and he takes solace in the fact that he knows he is free to, quote, "quit this prison whenever he wishes," end quote. This prison, as we understand from earlier, is the dream in which man lives. Schopenhauer hadn't even written his world as will and representation by this point, but it's interesting that many of his ideas are prefigured here. That Werther effectively sees happiness on earth as impossible for him because he's seen through the illusion of human striving. It never goes anywhere. Our will just serves to perpetuate our wretched existence. If he could forget this fact, he could live like the rest of the herd, but since he cannot forget it, he can only envy their happiness. We learn other things about Werther from his early observations and philosophical musings. In another letter in which he tells Wilhelm of his daily habits, his little spot at the inn where he reads Homer daily and drinks his coffee, he tells us about his day, in which he illustrated a scene of the nearby fields. He says he intends to focus his work on nature alone. Quote, "Nature has inexhaustible riches, and only nature creates a great artist. A good deal can be said of the advantages of rules, much the same as can be said in praise of bourgeois society. A man shaped by the rules will never produce anything tasteless or bad, just as a citizen who observes laws and decorum will never be an unbearable neighbor or an out-and-out villain. And yet, on the other hand, Say what you please, the rules will destroy the true feeling of nature and its true expression. It is the same as it is with love. A young fellow is totally infatuated with a girl, spends every hour of the day with her, wears himself out, and squanders his fortune to give her constant proof that his devotion to her knows no end. And then some Philistine, some man of public rank, comes and says to him, "My dear young sir, to love is only natural, but you must be true to human nature when you love. Divide up your hours, some for your work, and some for recreation with your girl," and so forth. If the man obeys, he will turn out a respectable young chap, and I should personally advise any prince to appoint him to his council. But his love will be done for, and so, if he is an artist, will his art. Oh, my friends, you ask why the torrent of genius so rarely pours forth, so rarely floods and thunders and overwhelms your astonished soul. Because, dear friends, on either bank dwell the cool, respectable gentlemen, whose summer houses, tulip beds, and cabbage patches would all be washed away, and who are therefore highly skilled in averting future dangers in good time by damming and digging channels. End quote. So this passage it's exemplary of the attitude of Goethe. He too sees nature as this great inspiration, a font, a well that his spirit could draw from. It's another core aspect of Romanticism. If we were to be cynical, we could call it an idealization or even worship of nature. But the way that nature is used in this passage is very interesting. I think Goethe expresses something far subtler in this passage than the way we perhaps normally understand Romanticism, because he's talking about the nature as a thing within each of us, not wild nature that's outside of, the human condition. The rules and limitations of society have their use. It wouldn't be sensible to simply discard them, but these limitations also serve to dam up or rechannel genius, which is something that comes from nature herself. It's the inevitable effect of civilization upon the individual. The passions have to be rerouted or controlled or suppressed. And when this moral regime is enacted, genius is winnowed down. In other words, genius is part and parcel with passion, which is part and parcel with nature, and one should therefore be willing to throw himself fully into his passions, to spend all he has extravagantly, squander himself and his wealth in pursuit of a passion. This is the only way for genius to burst forth, even if you might destroy yourself in the process. So again, we're learning things about Werther that go well beyond a story about a man who's depressed because a woman doesn't love him. Werther writes these words before he even meets Charlotte. He's already entertained the thought of quitting this prison, as he puts it. He's already entertained the thought of giving himself fully over to love, even at the cost of his life. So we can recognize this as part of the psychological profile of his character. And we could classify or categorize Werther as a manic depressive or any number of other things. I'm sure a psychiatrist or psychologist could have a fun time doing that. But on the other hand, I think it's more useful to our overall inquiry to consider how this further sketches out a portrait of a type that seems to resonate with people in the modern day. Werther feels like he has something extraordinary within himself that must be expressed. It's the limitations and rules of society that hem him in. His romanticism is not this idolatrous worship of nature. It's a recognition that raw passion is curtailed by society, the feeling that an artistic soul like himself is therefore somewhat alienated from society, managed and administrated as it is by practical, sensible men. Werther's meeting with Charlotte is the same, basically, as what happened to Goethe in real life. Werther meets Charlotte at a ball which her intended future husband cannot attend because he's out of town on business. In a letter to Wilhelm, Werther describes her in terms which Goethe might easily have used to describe his own Charlotte. Quote, "So much simplicity with so much understanding, so much goodness and so much resolve, and tranquility of the soul together with true life and vitality." End quote. We have explored how Werther has these contradictory desires, how he idealizes the simple life and yet sees himself as standing apart from it, as a pessimist, as an artist, as an aspirant to high society. This is another one of his yearnings in the early letters of the book, that he's been in Valheim for a decent while, but he's yet to meet any good society. So he wants to meet with and intermingle with the upper class, perhaps become accepted by them. In a sense, this is also, it's a variation on that desire for recognition. But I don't think the book should be solely understood this way or taken as a simple motif of class relations, as this book has sometimes been read by Marxist interpreters. We could look at it this way. Nobility is simultaneously a belonging and a setting apart. When one is accepted into high society, he becomes a man of high status. This signifies belonging to an exclusive, limited group, yes, but this is precisely because that group is elevated above others. And this is why I think Jerusalem's exclusion from high society, the ambassador's intentions to replace him, these ambitions are also taken by Goethe and rolled into the character of Werther, even though Goethe himself seems to have had little desire to make those kinds of social or political connections himself, if it meant taking time out of his intense schedule of reading Homer and going on walks. Goethe incorporates this element of Jerusalem's story because it further defines Werther's main characteristic. He's a man who thinks of himself as extraordinary, as somehow different from the ordinary types of people, and he wishes to be recognized as such within a celebrated and limited group. Charlotte seems to somehow embody both of Werther's contradictory desires for both acceptance and being set apart. She will stand for many things throughout the story. Later in the text, she replaces nature in Werther's conception. She will explicitly become sacred to him as an object of worship, the recipient of his prayers. In her, Werther desires something exclusive, right? Because romantic love is generally exclusive. But he also desires that possibility of having social bonds and taking pleasure in the simple life, which is not exclusive but universal, pleasures that anyone could have. Charlotte is charged with raising her many siblings. She does so selflessly. As Werther comes to know her, he also takes great joy in being around the children, seeing how Charlotte brightens their lives. In short, Charlotte begins to represent that entire prospect of elusive earthly happiness. Certainly, we could look at this cynically as just a kind of infatuation, but we also have to consider that many of these themes with Werther exist before he meets Charlotte. So these desires are pre-existing, but why is it that they incarnate into Charlotte? Why does she become an object of Werther's desire? René Girard might say it's precisely because Charlotte is forbidden to Werther, promised to another, that she specifically becomes the object of his desire. It's precisely because everyone wants to be a part of high society that Werther desires a place within it. Girard has this mimetic theory of desire, that we ultimately desire what others desire. We triangulate to what we desire from looking at what others are desiring. And we effectively develop our desires by observing the desires of others. He developed that theory primarily from perceiving this underlying theme in novels. It certainly applies here. And remember what Goethe said when reflecting on his affections for Charlotte. The greatest happiness is found in longing, and true longing is found in longing for the unattainable. Why would this be the case? Why is it that we always want what we can't have? Well, I think somebody like Girard would say, of course we want what we can't have. The very fact that it's unattainable is, it could be like evidence that it is desired by others, and therefore evidence that this is a true thing of value, a worthwhile desire to have. Werther is smitten with Charlotte from the beginning. They dance together. They go and share an intimate moment, watching a storm roll in from the window, and he more or less melts as she lays her hand on his. They take their leave from the ball together and agree to see each other the next day. Immediately, we can see how the experience has shifted Werther's whole view of Valheim. He says the village is close to heaven. He says his days are as happy as any that God laid aside for his saints. He says he's enjoyed the purest pleasures of life. Charlotte, of course, told him on their first meeting that she's already intended for someone else, but this does nothing to stop Werther from plunging fully into his romantic feelings. He confesses it plainly to Wilhelm in another letter, quote, "You should see what an oaf I look if her name is mentioned in company, especially if someone asks me how I like her. Like her? I utterly detest the word. What kind of man would merely like Lotte, and not have all his senses and feelings dominated by her? Like her? Recently, some fellow asked me how I like Ossian." End quote. Macpherson's Ossian becomes another important theme in this text. Ossian purported to be a collection of epic poems from the Celtic world. Even at the time of its publication, there were many who immediately questioned the authenticity of the work, though there was by no means a consensus on this fact. Nowadays there is. The consensus is that the work was written by Macpherson himself. But Macpherson claimed to have translated these poems from ancient sources written in Gaelic, and just as there was a camp who doubted the authenticity, there was a camp who believed in the authenticity of Ossian, and held Ossian side by side with Homer. In effect, Ossian represented for the Celtic world what Homer did for the Hellenic world. Werther is as much a devotee of Ossian as he is of Homer, but as the story progresses, Ossian begins to replace Homer as his favorite work. In fact, in part 2, he writes, quote, "Ossian has ousted Homer from my heart," end quote. One way to understand the symbolism of this shift might be by appealing perhaps anachronistically to Nietzsche, in that where Nietzsche found the Dionysian in Greek culture and counterposed it to the modern, for Goethe the Hellenic world was decidedly more Apollonian. For Goethe, the world of Ossian is perhaps a better analog for the Dionysian. In Macpherson's tales, the protagonists can literally die of happiness or of grief. His stories are tragic and tumultuous. They involve loves that end in sorrow. Werther's lack of self-awareness about his situation can sometimes be a bit humorous. In one letter, he writes of a conversation that he has with Lotte about the ways in which men can deceive themselves. In the very next letter, he writes, quote, "No, I am not deceiving myself. I can read a genuine interest in me and my fate in those dark eyes of hers. Yes, I can feel, and I know I may trust my own heart in this. Oh, dare I utter the words, those words that contain all heaven for me. I can feel that she loves me." End quote. So already at this point in the story, the prospect that Charlotte loves him contains all heaven. She's becoming a sacred figure, a receptacle for the very meaning of life, transcending a mere mortal. Werther's self-deception here ought to be obvious, and yet he's just said he knows all the ways in which men can deceive himself, so surely he would not fall victim to that, right? But soon Albert returns. Reality comes due. And in his first letter to Wilhelm following this, we can see Werther's delusion begin to intermingle with a dawning awareness. He can't stand the thought of Charlotte being in the possession of someone else, and yet he cannot help but take a liking to Albert. He can't find any fault in the man. Yet again, the situation mirrors that of Goethe in real life. And like with Goethe, with his situation, Werther isn't stupid. He's not unaware of the facts of his situation, but Werther willfully deludes himself. By turns, he says, "Her intended is here, so I must leave. But also, I will naturally continue to spend time with her whenever I can, whenever Albert is not around." He writes, quote, "I can no longer take pleasure in being with Lotte. What shall I call it? Folly or delusion? Everything I now know, I knew before Albert's arrival. I knew I had no claim on her, nor did I raise any." End quote. But then further in the letter, quote, "Between you and me, I keep a careful watch for times when he is busy elsewhere, and whoosh, there I am, and I'm always happy to find her on her own." End quote. His friend Wilhelm tells him that he must either commit to winning Charlotte's heart or put the thought out of his mind and move on. Werther agrees and says this is quite sensible, and yet it's easier said than done. He knows the rational thing to do, the right thing to do, but his desire doesn't let him do it. He compares his situation to that of a man who must amputate his arm, but risks his own life by hesitating, in a state of doubt and indecision. He says he has moments of courage when he feels he could shrug it all off, and yet the intractable desire for Charlotte always returns. Albert and Werther seem to like one another, just as Goethe and Kästner liked one another. They end up spending time together, in spite of Werther's intention to avoid him. In one of my favorite scenes in the novel, the climax is foreshadowed by Werther's asking to borrow 2 of Albert's pistols for a journey he's about to take. At one point, while Albert is going on and on about the propriety of keeping one's guns unloaded, Werther zones out and suddenly finds himself in a brooding mood and spontaneously takes the pistol and places it against his own forehead. Albert is horrified. He snatches the gun away from Werther. He declares that it would be foolish to shoot oneself, and that he cannot possibly understand such an act. In response to this, Werther mounts a defense of the act of taking one's life, just as Jerusalem himself did in the form of an essay. Quote, "Why is it, I demanded, that when people speak of things, they must promptly pronounce them foolish or clever, wicked or good? Whatever does it all mean? Have you really grasped the true and inmost nature of an action? Can you really give a definite account of the reasons why it happened and why it had to happen? If you understood them, you might not judge so hastily." End quote. The response is interesting because these ideas would later be articulated by Nietzsche, strangely enough, not specifically as regards the act that he's talking about, but notice that this isn't even really the topic of Werther's rebuttal. He focuses on the mysteriousness of the action, the fact that we think we can make judgments about the actions people take implicitly based on an assessment of whether their intentions are smart or stupid, good or evil. Nietzsche would later go on to argue that so much of the genealogy of the action is unintentional. It is unconscious, misunderstood by the onlookers, even misunderstood by the one who acts. We attach these judgments to actions nevertheless. Why? In order to assign responsibility, make an evaluation as to whether the action was correct or incorrect, in order to encourage or discourage behavior. So Werther's line of defense here is interesting, even though it's totally unconvincing to Albert. He simply reasserts that some actions must be admitted to be wicked, regardless of all that. It's interesting because it again places Werther as the quote-unquote Dionysian outside of the common morals, speaking for passion in the depths. This setting apart in the many forms that it occurs reveals something about Werther and something about this sensitive archetype. Such a one follows feeling and is an apologist for feeling, even when it's perceived as dumb or wicked. He's more concerned with the depth of feeling, which ultimately can't be expressed or even understood by the multitude or even communicated by language. Werther serves as an apologist for feeling when he says that there are exceptions to the rule when it comes to designating an act as wicked. Insofar as we might be more lenient in the law when a husband kills an unfaithful wife and her seducer because it's understood to be out of wrath. We are lenient with the thief who steals a loaf of bread to feed his family because he steals out of love. When faced with acts taken out of powerful and relatable emotions, quote, "Even our laws, cold-blooded and pedantic as they are moved to relent and forego punishment," end quote. But Albert doesn't see things this way. He advocates for the conventional wisdom. The reason why we forego punishment in those cases is because we see such people, driven by strong passions to commit heinous crimes, as insane or intoxicated, and thus not in their right mind. Werther's counters that many great men who have done extraordinary things have been regarded as intoxicated or insane. Quote, "How intolerable it is in everyday life, too, to hear them say, the moment anyone does something remotely free or noble or out of the ordinary, 'The fellow's drunk, he's off his head. You should be ashamed of yourselves, you sensible people, you sages," end quote. Albert's counter to this is, of course, that it's a false equivocation. Quote, "You were certainly wrong to compare suicide, which is what we were talking about, with great accomplishments, since it cannot be considered as anything but a weakness." End quote. Werther is incensed by this because he sees it as a platitude, and he admits he might not make the most coherent arguments, but he feels he's speaking from the heart, and Albert is simply giving him these rote replies. Werther argues it's not a matter of moral weakness or strength, rather one experiences sufferings the way that one experiences a fever. One may endure those sufferings or he might perish from them, but this is no different morally than when a man succumbs to an illness. The two go back and forth on this, and Werther gives examples, but Albert simply will not see his point of view. Werther's concluding remark is that, quote, "Humankind is merely human, and that jot of rational sense a man may possess is of little or no avail once passion is raging and the bounds of human nature are hemming him in. Quite the contrary, but more of that another time." End quote. And with this, they break off the conversation. Now, is Werther right about this? This last point at the end. I mean, we don't have to accept his arguments as a justification, but I think modern views of mental health would agree. We don't tend to see it in terms of moral weakness any longer. We do tend to see it as a person being overcome by negative emotion that they can't cope with. We've even begun to use the language of illness and disease to refer to mental states. So it's similar to succumbing to a physiological condition, maybe even exactly the same. But Werther reasons from that to this romantic perspective. We're essentially helpless against raging passions. Our rational sense, at least, is helpless against it. A few letters later, we see how this tension in his relationship with Lotte is beginning to affect him. His unrequited yearning is beginning to cast a dim light on all existence. Months ago, Werther was reveling in the beauties of nature. Now he writes, quote, "Did it really have to be like this? That the source of man's contentment becomes the source of his misery. My heart's immense and ardent feeling for living nature, which overwhelmed me with so great a joy and made the world about me a very paradise, has now become an unbearable torment, a demon that goes with me everywhere, torturing me." End quote. And he gives a gorgeous description of several nature scenes that he says at other times made him feel like creation moved within his very soul. And it's only by recalling those times, he says, he's able to hang on. But now the pain of his longing has ruined him, and it's this great change in his soul that prompts him to philosophize about the transience of all things. He says that the veil has been drawn away, the illusion of infinite life has given way to an abyss of the grave yawning open. And he begins to describe the world again, to say it anachronistically, in Schopenhauerian terms. Quote, "And so I go my fearful way betwixt heaven and earth, and all their active forces, and all I can see is a monster, forever devouring, regurgitating, chewing, and gorging." End quote. Werther's depression gets worse. He says that now books nauseate him. His feeling for nature is gone, his imagination is gone. It is in this state of mind that he applies for a job at the embassy which will take him away from Walheim, away from Charlotte, whom he can never have. Even as he is in utter misery, he still wavers back and forth in this contradiction between loving and hating being near to her. Albert and Lotte give him some very thoughtful presents on his birthday, which reinvigorates his attachment to them. He says if, his sickness, his melancholia could be cured, surely these people, of all people, would cure him. In the next letter, he calls himself a wretched fool. He declares that he is deceiving himself. But in the next lines, says he cannot pray but to Charlotte. Finally, Werther is accepted by the ambassador, and the first part of the novel ends after Werther and Charlotte's final meeting together. They share a philosophical discussion that Goethe and Lotte shared in real life. Charlotte tells Werther, quote, "There will be a life after death, Werther, but will we find each other again and know each other?" End quote. She wonders about her dear departed ones, like her mother, whether she'll see her in the hereafter. But Werther, of course, is thinking of whether the two of them shall meet again in another life, or perhaps with another chance at romance. And so Werther assures her that they will find one another again. And he says, "This is the hardest thing I've ever done, but now I shall be able to do anything. And with that he departs. The ending of the first part is essentially how Goethe's unrequited love story really ended. The character of Werther is a blend of the two men who served as his inspiration throughout the text. He speaks in the language of Goethe as an artist and as an imaginative and philosophical man, and yet he possesses more violent passions, the kind of which a man could perish. He's moody and pessimistic in a way that more resembles Jerusalem. But even though the two are sort of blended throughout the character, the second part of the story more closely resembles Jerusalem's tale. Appropriately, much of the beginning of the second part involves Werther striving to make something of himself while working for the ambassador, making friends, making connections, again wishing to be accepted by high society. But he finds that the ambassador greatly dislikes him. He nitpicks every little mistake. He micromanages. He wants everything just so. And so Werther finds there's no outlet for his spirit, for his creativity, for his personality. Every time he tries to do something his way, the ambassador says it's wrong. He never approves. Again, Werther experiences a kind of revulsion at the human condition. The whole thing is an endless competition for class and rank. Of course, he's caught up in this competition also, but the pettiness and vanity that he perceives all around him nauseates him. His only compensation is becoming friends with the Count, whom he says is a kindred soul, sensitive to friendship and love. The Count seems to recognize the potential in Werther and counsels him appropriately to reconcile himself to the realities of his position, do the best to fulfill his duties. The ambassador, meanwhile, dislikes the Count. He dislikes even more that Werther prefers the Count's company to his own, and constantly puts the Count down in Werther's presence. Werther seems to be on the verge of moving on from his unrequited love. He even writes to Charlotte of befriending a woman who happens to be one of her friends, whom he refers to as Miss Von B. We as readers are only given the abbreviation for many of these characters. And he tells Lotte that Von B has a great soul that shines out of her eyes. Somewhat similar terms to how he described her. And while their friendship doesn't really get a chance to blossom, we get the impression that, despite his conflicts with the ambassador, Werther might have at least a chance at success in life after leaving Valheim, maybe even a new romantic prospect. But soon Werther's attempt at a new lease on life collapses. Werther is rudely reminded that he is not a part of the aristocracy. Werther is a Bürgerlicher, a middle-class intellectual but with no title of rank. And there's a really interesting dynamic to consider in European high society at this time. The upper strata of the aristocracy are more open to meritocracy and associating with people of lower orders than, say, the local aristocrats. So Werther is a favorite of the Count. He also meets the prince earlier in the story. The prince takes a liking to Werther as well. The prince, however, is so far above the local nobility that he is above their squabbles and jockeying for rank. The local nobility, on the other hand, is rigid, we might say precisely because they are the lower nobles. The nobility of the prince is never in question, but the nobility of a local family, of minor aristocrats, might be forgotten if it is not constantly enforced, and as such they police the boundaries of the aristocracy. They remind the non-nobles of their place, their status obsessed, precisely because they are at the lower strata of the nobility. There's also sort of like a philosophical difference, we might say, in that the higher nobility at this time consider themselves to be enlightened. They're more influenced by the writings of, say, Voltaire. They're more impressed by talent and intellect than by rank afforded by birth. Whereas the local lesser nobles are more provincial. Their focus is on enforcing the local order of rank. And Werther has already ingratiated himself a bit too much to Miss Von B. The local nobles see their job essentially as keeping their noble women away from such people as a middle-class Bürgerlicher. And many of them probably don't like that the Count has taken such a liking to this Werther. And so there is soon an embarrassing incident at the house of the Count. It's a rather long anecdote that Verter relates I'll read this little story in an abridged form. Quote, Count C is fond of me and accords me special favor. I dined with him yesterday, the very day when the ladies and gentlemen of the nobility regularly assemble at his house in the evening. It never crossed my mind, nor did it occur to me that we subordinates do not belong in that company. I dined with the Count, and afterwards we walked up and down the great hall in conversation, together with Colonel B., who joined us, and the time for the assembly gradually approached. God knows it never entered my head. Then in came the most gracious Lady Von S. with her spouse and her scheming little goose of a flat-chested, trimly corseted daughter, and in passing they gave me looks and twitched their nostrils in their usual, oh-so-aristocratic way. And since I cannot abide this breed, I was about to take my leave, and was just waiting for the Count to disengage himself from their appalling twaddle, when Miss Von B. entered the hall. My heart always feels freer the moment I see her, so I stayed, stationed myself behind her chair, and did not notice until some time had passed that she was speaking less openly than normal, and with a certain embarrassment. It was striking. Can she too be like the rest of them? The hall had filled meanwhile. All of them were gathered there. I was busy with my own thoughts, and only paid attention to my Miss Von B. I did not register that the women were whispering at the far end of the hall. The Count approached me and took me aside in the bay of a window. You know how absurd things are, he said. I gather the company takes exception to your presence here. I should not wish on any account. Your Excellency, I interrupted. I beg 1,000 pardons. I should have thought of it sooner, but I trust you will forgive my oversight. The Count shook my hand feelingly, in a manner that spoke volumes. I made my inconspicuous disappearance from the illustrious assembly. End quote. This incident is immediately damaging to Werther's reputation. He says he's approached by a friend who apologizes for what happened, revealing that this incident is already the talk of the town. Werther plays it off. He says he was just happy to leave and get some fresh air, but he has many such encounters, with others offering their sympathies. Those who envy him, he says, take pleasure in the incident. But worst of all, it ruins his relationship with Miss Von B. He says in the following letter that everything is conspiring against me. Miss Von B meets him on one of the avenues, and she tells him how she's suffered for her association with him. She should have said something, she admits. She says that the nobles assembled in the Count's house would have rather left than be in Werther's presence. And worst of all, she tells him that her aunt was present at the affair, and that, quote, last night and this morning I had to endure a sermon concerning my acquaintanceship with you, and I have been obliged to hear you condemned and disparaged, and I was neither able nor permitted to say much in your defense, end quote. And she says she can't really associate with him any longer. With this development, Werther resigns his position at the embassy. Werther wanders for a bit after this. He goes back to his hometown for a while. He spends some time with the prince at his hunting lodge. But Werther soon finds the prince to be tedious. He says that the prince's point of view is often just a reflection of the last thing he's read about or heard about. Perhaps the prince's acceptance of Werther, at least, is just enough for him to regain some self-respect or some dignity after having been turned out by the nobles. He's always on the edge of society. He's not fully cast out, not fully alienated, but not fully accepted. And so with this, Werther returns to Walheim. He says that he just wants to be near to Charlotte again. They have a relatively pleasant reunion, but his mood has become even more erratic, and his mind begins to turn to darker thoughts. Quote, when I am lost in my daydreams, I cannot help wondering, what if Albert were to die? You would, yes, and she would, and then I fantasize till I am at the brink of the abyss, and I flinch back with a shudder. When I go out by the gateway, taking the road I drove alone the first time I picked up Lotta for the ball, how very different it all is. It is all over, all of it. There is not a hint of the world that once was, not one pulse beat of those past emotions. I feel like a ghost returning to the burnt-out ruins of the castle he built in his prime as a prince. End quote. The latter half of part 2 it's full of really great depressive prose. It's wonderful aphorisms of emotional pain that could have come from the hand of Chiron. Werther considers his suffering as unique, greater than any suffering from any other man from history. And yet he says when he reads the work of ancient poets, It's like he's reading the inner workings of his own soul. He says he's lost the ability to pray entirely, that all nature and its glories are now frozen to his eye. He's now powerless to extract any joy from anything. He rants and raves. He writes short letters that consist of nothing more than sentence-long lamentations. He speaks of the void in his chest. He talks about tearing his heart open. Obviously, at this point in the story, everything is leading towards Werther's eventual confession of his love to Charlotte. He writes, quote, "I have already been on the point of falling at her breast 100 times, end quote, just as it happened with Jerusalem. But there are a few seemingly random incidents that occur just before this which are worth considering in our analysis. First, the madman. Werther happens along a figure gathering flowers for his love, or so it seems at first. It soon becomes clear that this man is delusional. He says that his love is rich, she already has plenty of jewels and a crown, implying that his love is an empress or something like that. This man, who is out of his wits, also pines for a time when he was happy and contented. And soon the man's mother comes and finds him, and she describes him to Werther as a terrible cross that she has to bear, and she tells him with the story of what's happened, that after a fever, he lost his mind. And Werther asks about the time the man spoke of when he was happy and contented, and the man's mother tells him that happy time he's remembering is when he was interred in the insane asylum. Werther says, quote, "This struck me like a thunderbolt. That time when you were happy. I shouted, hurrying towards the town. That time when you were thoroughly contented. Dear God in heaven, was this the fate thou ordained for man? That he should only be happy before he has yet attained his reason, or after he has lost it again? Miserable wretch, and yet I envy your melancholy and the confusion of your senses that has laid you waste. Hopefully you go forth in winter to pick flowers for your queen, and are sad when you cannot find any, and cannot understand why there are none. And I go out with no hope or purpose at all, and return home as I departed." End quote. Is this the fate of man? We could recall Werther's Schopenhauerian observations earlier, that when we bring the light of reason to examine what our lives really consist of, they simply consist of perpetuating our lives. We live to go on living. It's a tedious, monotonous affair. And yet we often have nostalgic feelings of yearning for a happiness we experienced earlier in our lives. Why? Well, Werther says it's because that was before the age of reason. And this dimwit had happiness again when he had totally lost his reason. He felt contented upon the annihilation of his good sense. When we consider how Werther has railed against sensible men throughout this novel, often taking the side of the emotions, we can now see how he's beginning to turn against reason altogether, as that which shackles us to an unhappy existence. Charlotte had somehow come to represent that possibility of magically transcending that hamster wheel of dissatisfaction that is human life. That's why he comes to think of her as something divine, because it would almost take a divine act to lift us out of that human state. Now, with a little more life experience, Werther would have realized the absolute folly of this idea. If I can just get the girl, if I can just get this romantic relationship, then I'll be happy, finally. Things don't really work like that. But this salvation is beginning to seem impossible now. Werther has become self-aware that his life is ruled by an impossible fantasy. And this is where he begins to fantasize about Albert's death. And remember, he likes Albert. He doesn't think he's an evil man. He doesn't think he's a man who deserves to die. But if only some accident were to happen, then we could be together. So he's beginning to have these very disturbing ideations and thought patterns. And this leads into another anecdote involving one of the townsfolk. This time it's told by the editor. He summarizes the final events of Werther's life. And the most significant event in the novel that doesn't directly involve Werther or Albert or Charlotte is the murder committed by a farmhand whom Werther met earlier in part 1. This farmhand was deeply devoted to a widow whom he cared for and apparently loved her deeply. And at the time, Werther is impressed with his devotion. Meeting this man was part of the allure of Valheim, part of what makes him fall in love with the little town. But after the widow is visited by a new suitor, this farmhand kills him. When Werther learns of this, he rushes to the scene and he confronts the man. He cries out, quote, "You wretched man, what have you done?" End quote. And following this, Werther defends the man to the authorities. The editor writes that Werther felt he understood this man and his motives. He mounts every possible defense that he can. None of it is persuasive, and Albert pleads with Werther, telling him this man cannot be saved. This exchange is significant, first because Werther is once again the advocate for passion over and against what is sensible. The town's constabulary basically argues what you're advocating for would destroy the entire foundations of law and the state. But it's also significant because Werther sees himself in the murderer, and by saving him, perhaps he thinks he can save himself. In fact, he writes in his journal that he can see now the man cannot be saved, that, quote, we cannot be saved, end quote. Furthermore, the dark thought that he had earlier, what if Albert were to die? Surely he recognizes the same dark emotion driving that farmhand to commit murder. He even writes at one point that this whole situation with himself and Lotta and Albert must come to a head somehow. He entertains three possibilities. Either Albert must die, or she must die, or Werther must die. And so in a really twisted way, Werther perhaps believes that choosing himself as the one to die is the heroic thing, because the only alternative for him at this point would be to kill Albert or Charlotte, which would be wrong. This is the only way to resolve things, to free himself from this horrible feeling, the void within his chest. The third in this relationship has to be removed. And this rather twisted way of viewing things will even develop and proceed further in some of the final statements that Werther makes in this novel. He tries to tell Charlotte that he will never see her and Albert again, but she wishes instead that he find some way to count his blessings, moderate his obsessive passions, and, quote, put an end to this dismal attachment to a creature who can do nothing but pity you, end quote. Those are harsh words to hear from an unrequited love. Anyone who's ever been in love knows how offensive it is to be pitied by the one you're infatuated with. Charlotte continues, quote, do you not sense that you are deceiving yourself and willing your own destruction? Why me of all people, Werther? I belong to another, so why me, end quote. As the editor tells us, Charlotte genuinely cares for Werther and wishes very much that he could simply get rid of these feelings. And in her head, she runs through a list of friends that she might pair him off with. She imagines, well, if I could just find him someone else, perhaps the situation could get better and we could be friends again. Why does it have to be me? Surely it doesn't have to be me. And the editor's omniscience becomes a bit absurd at times, and it becomes especially absurd in the following passage, where the editor does not only know Charlotte's inner thoughts, but even thoughts that she isn't consciously aware of. So he writes, quote, she had reviewed all her women friends in her mind and had found fault with every one of them and could hit upon none that she would want to see him with. All of these reflections prompted a profound realization, albeit one which she was not consciously aware of, that her secret heart's desire was to keep him for herself. Yet at the same time she reminded herself that she could not and might not keep him, end quote. And so Werther's the one usually expressing the possessive feelings, and certainly Charlotte is far more proper in her relationship to Werther than he is with her. But this reveals she has her own possessive feelings, and it's worth noting one of the most popular scenes that was often painted or illustrated, or just otherwise portrayed in the Werther trend, was Charlotte weeping over Werther's grave, which is a scene that never happens in the novel. But there are hints throughout that Charlotte has some kind of feeling for Werther that perhaps goes beyond mere friendship. That becomes the basis for these later portrayals. Finally, Werther returns for one last meeting, much sooner than expected. She had asked at their last meeting for him to give her and Albert some space, some peace. Stay away for some time because it's almost Christmas Eve. There's a lot going on. We have to cool off for a little bit, please. But as he shows up, sooner than she expected, her heart beats wildly as she hears Werther approaching. And while she does deign to see him, she's conflicted. She thinks to send for some friends so she doesn't have to be alone with him. One moment she wishes they'd hurry up and arrive. The next moment she wishes they would stay away. Ultimately, they say they can't. They're busy. She tries to play the piano. She can't conjure anything from her hands. Finally, she asks if Werther has anything to read to her, and he does not. So she takes Werther's own translations of Ossian out of her drawer, which he had given to her as a gift, and she asks him to read Ossian to her. He agrees. And for a moment in the narrative, we're transported to Macpherson's tragic and expressive world of Celtic epics. By the end of Werther's reading, they're both tearing up, and Werther throws himself at her feet, and Lotte is conflicted. She grabs his hands and squeezes them, pressing them against her. Their warm cheeks touch, and finally he kisses her. She cries out in a choked voice and turns away. Quote, hastily she stood up, and in a voice of anxious confusion, trembling between love and anger, told him, "This is the last time. Werther, you will never see me again." End quote. He is obviously devastated, but isn't this what he himself has asked for in the past? She shuts herself away, and he begs her for one final word, but she doesn't answer, and finally he leaves, saying, quote, "Farewell, Lotte. Forever, adieu." End quote. The story ends as Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem's story ends. Werther sends to Albert asking to borrow his pistols for a journey he's about to take. Charlotte has not yet told Albert what happened between her and Werther at this time. This is for many reasons, but among them is that she was worried what Albert would think of her. This would reflect poorly on her as well, even if, rationally speaking, she was not at fault. And therefore she says nothing when Werther's servant arrives asking for the pistols. Albert turns coolly to his wife and says, "Give him the pistols." And he tells the servant to wish Werther a pleasant journey. The words strike Lotte as ominous, and she slowly, hesitatingly goes and takes down the pistols, dusts them off, and hands them to the servant. She's filled with foreboding. She has an inkling, perhaps, about what is about to happen. Albert, perhaps, does not. It's a little less clear what he thinks. We might imagine that he might just be glad to be rid of Werther at this point. He's probably just happy to hear that he's departing again. Okay, finally, this guy is leaving. I'm not going to think too critically about this whole situation. Werther then writes his final letters. He writes one to Wilhelm, one to Albert, and he writes a final letter to Charlotte. Then, as Jerusalem did, he has his servant bring him a bottle of wine. He settles his debts. He burns a great deal of his paperwork. He seals a number of essays and reflections to send to Wilhelm. He writes a final word to Lotte just before the deed, in which he frames the act in a grotesquely Christian way. Again, he frames this as a kind of sacrifice of himself. Perhaps, so he doesn't have to kill Albert or Lotte. He thanks God for giving him the strength to carry out the act, and he says, quote, "It has been given to only a few noble beings to shed their blood for those they love, and by their death to create a new life 100 times better for their friends." End quote. These are classic depressive thoughts, but Werther tries to valorize them in Christian language, which we can definitely understand a lot of the controversy behind this novel if one doesn't understand that depicting a character is not the same as sanctioning or endorsing that character. Down to almost the last detail, Goethe describes Werther's death and its surrounding circumstances using the details of Jerusalem's death. He shoots himself, but he does not die immediately. He's still alive in the morning, slowly bleeding in agony, still wearing his trademark blue waistcoat. He finally expires the next afternoon. He's buried in a place chosen for himself. Albert does not attend, neither does Charlotte, for there are fears for her life. Even the infamous final words of the novel were originally included in Kästner's letter to Goethe, in all their bluntness. Quote, "Guildsmen bore the body, no priest attended him." End quote. So after all of this, you may have gathered the plot of The Sorrows of Young Werther is relatively straightforward. The characters and their motives are not terribly complicated. But this book is still very much worth reading because of the prose, the experience of reading it. Goethe has many philosophical musings throughout the text. These cannot be taken as Goethe's own perspective, but rather they reveal a depth to the character. You get a really intimate understanding of his inner life, the thoughts and feelings spiraling around in his head, and Goethe conveys this very convincingly. He feels like a real person. And that's because this story is real. His inner life is informed by Goethe's own real feelings. But now that we've gone over the novel and its major scenes and themes, I want to take a stab at understanding this sensitive young man thing and its relationship to Bonapartism. To summarize my thoughts on the matter, I would say this novel clued me into something I wasn't sure I could articulate before I read the novel, even though I think I was aware of it. And it only really became clear when I considered Bonaparte's love of the sorrows of young Werther. And that is, there's something about existential feelings of alienation, of pessimistic judgments about society, the place of the outcast or the black sheep, that lends itself to feelings of elitism, or at least it can. If one finds themselves feeling as though he's standing outside the everyday ways of life of the rest of the human race, as though their simple happiness is denied to him, if you feel as though you've been excluded unfairly, perhaps either from that society or from the limited aristocratic circles you feel you should be a part of, owing to your talents, your genius, your merit, your intellect. Well, when you're in that sort of mindset, there's two ways you could interpret that situation. I mean, I'm sure there's more than two, but for our purposes, we'll just consider two of them. One could tell a story to themselves about inferiority, that the reason why they're excluded is because they're not good enough. But the other way to go with it is to say, I'm too good for them. It's to tell a story about superiority. And notice Werther almost never writes of himself in terms that point to an inferiority complex. Even when he's being turned out of the noble assembly, he's still passing judgment on the aristocrats, saying they prattle on their dismal company and so on. Even as he wishes he could experience the dumb, simple happiness of the farmers, he thinks this is all impossible for him. But why? Because of his intellect. Because he's seen how the life of man is but a dream, a transient thing. Even though he likes Albert overall, he still sees him as a man who spouts empty platitudes when deep topics are being discussed. Virtually the only person that he sees himself as inferior to is Charlotte. But this is largely because she's come to symbolize nature, the sacred, the infinite. She's the solution to all his problems. Whenever Werther refers to himself as a wretch, it's to lament the state of either all mankind that he has a unique insight to, or the fact that Charlotte doesn't return his love, simple as that. And so I think this archetype of the sensitive young man is someone who feels he doesn't fit into the ordinary world because of how extraordinary he is. It's ultimately an elitist impulse that's expressed in this story. And I think the reflex that many people have in response to this is to be denigrating or dismissive. This is scarily close to red pill ideology, or Werther is just a loser, or a failson, or however such people like to put it. And I think that, for one, if you're genuinely worried about such things, scolding people and making fun of them is rather ineffective for liberating them from these thought patterns, if that is your goal. But secondly, I think it's easy to underestimate how this is a broader cultural trope. So many of our most popular stories play into this idea of a special individual who's destined for great things, who's destined for so much more than an ordinary life. This is the trope of the chosen one, of Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker. We're so enculturated to believe in the special individual from humble circumstances who's destined for so much more. The Sorrows of Young Werther perhaps scares us because it portrays a type who thinks of himself in these terms, but nevertheless fails to actualize his specialness. But this doesn't mean that this thought tendency is not altogether common in our culture. We tend to admire people who desire things that they can't have and decide to go after those things anyway. It becomes uncomfortable when the object of one's desires is a person, but even this is lionized by the romance genre all the time, the pursuer who has to overcome the coy protests of his crush. And so the irony is that Werther can be read as a cautionary tale, the counterexample of which is Goethe himself. Effectively, Goethe and Jerusalem have the same situation, but Jerusalem crashes and burns, whereas Goethe channels his feelings into art, writing, poetry. When Goethe's postscript says, "Be a man and don't follow me," he means it. He means to tell us that these obsessive passions, this depth of feeling that Werther thinks sets him apart from everyone else, should not lead you to destruction. Goethe found a way to avert his destruction by making his passions productive. The novel is still a great apology for the passions, not in the model of Werther himself, but in the model of Goethe. Goethe has the right to tell such passionate people that they ought to man up, because he himself reveals through this text that he knows exactly what they feel. He has felt the same things. He has overcome these feelings. He's turned them into art. He's turned them into productivity. He's turned them into a source of inspiration. That's the point of this novel, not to wallow in the image, in the mold of Werther, of that type of life. And perhaps this can account for Napoleon Bonaparte's own engagement with the novel. Perhaps Napoleon could have suffered the same fate as Werther himself had he not found his own outlet for making his passions creative. In Goethe's case, it was the greatest corpus of German writing. In Napoleon's case, it was the French Empire. When Napoleon met Goethe, his first words famously were, "You are a man." I think we can take this to mean that the two immediately sort of see eye to eye. They immediately understand each other. And so as a final thought, I want to take a look at Goethe's account of that conversation, particularly the bits concerning the Sorrows of Young Werther. He says that Napoleon, quote, brought the conversation to Werther, which he must have studied in detail. After several perfectly appropriate observations, he mentioned a specific part and said to me, "Why did you do that? It is not natural." And he spoke at length on this, and with perfect accuracy. I listened with a calm face, and I replied with a smile of satisfaction that I didn't know whether anyone had ever made the same criticism, but that I found it perfectly justified, and that I agreed that one could find fault with this passage's lack of authenticity. But, I added, a poet can perhaps be excused for taking refuge in an artifice which is hard to spot, when he wants to produce certain effects that could not be created simply and naturally. The emperor seemed to agree with me. He returned to drama and made some very sensible remarks, as a man who had observed the tragic stage with a great deal of attention, like a criminal judge, and who felt very deeply how far French theater had strayed from nature and truth. End quote. As for what Napoleon's critique of Werther was, we shall never know. Goethe was asked about this by Eckermann, and he remained tight-lipped about it. This is Eckermann's account of that conversation, which is rather long, so I will read from it in an abridged form. Quote, "The conversation now turned on Werther. 'That,' said Goethe, 'is a creation which I, like the pelican, fed with the blood of my own heart. It contains so much from the innermost recesses of my breast, so much feeling and thought, that it might easily be spread into a novel of 10 such volumes. Besides, as I have often said, I have only read the book once since its appearance, and have taken good care not to read it again. I dread lest I should once more experience the peculiar mental state from which it was produced.' Napoleon," said I, "pointed out to you a passage in Verter, which it appeared to him would not stand a strict examination, and this you allowed. I should much like to know what passage he meant." "Guess," said Goethe, with a mysterious smile. "Now," said I almost think it is where Charlotte sends the pistols to Werther, without saying a word to Albert, and without imparting to him her misgivings and apprehensions. You have given yourself great trouble to find a motive for this silence, but it does not appear to hold good against the urgent necessity where the life of the friend was at stake. Your remark," returned Goethe, "is really not bad, but I do not think it right to reveal whether Napoleon meant this passage or another. However, be that as it may, your observation is quite as correct as his." End quote. While Goethe leaves the question open as to whether or not Eckermann hit on the same objection, judging from his reaction, I would guess that it was something else. For my part, my biggest problem with the narrative is the omniscience of the editor, though whether or not this was Napoleon's critique, we cannot know either. I think it's doubtful that that's the case. And while I tried long and hard to determine what it was that Napoleon found fault with, I couldn't come to a satisfying conclusion that would be anything other than speculation. What I will say is that Napoleon's criticism was clearly that of someone who had become deeply, deeply familiar with the work, as Goethe himself says, and it must have been the kind of critique that one makes of a work that you love. You notice all those little faults and imperfections the more closely you study a story. Perhaps more tellingly, his critique, whatever it was that Goethe's work was not natural, some part of the work. That's an insight into not only what the significance of the work held for Napoleon, but also why this work continues to fascinate. As Goethe himself says, he nourished the work in his own blood. And we know from our study of the background of the work that he drew on real life in order to create it. And just as Werther, Goethe himself was a devotee of nature and strove to draw upon nature as his chief inspiration. The power of the Sorrows of Young Werther is to be found chiefly in its naturalism. Whatever themes we might draw out of the novel, whatever subtexts, whatever subtleties our literary criticism might reveal, it is, first and foremost, an outpouring of real feelings connected to a real event. And in relating this, Goethe touches on a kind of timeless experience. He embellishes and exaggerates that experience, perhaps, and thus in some places ends up breaking with that naturalism, but naturalism is the key, the foundation of the whole thing. And in his conversations with Eckermann on this topic, Goethe had some keen reflections on this as a much older man. Quote, I asked the question whether the great effect produced by the appearance of Werther was really to be attributed to the period. I cannot, said I, reconcile myself to this view, though it is so extensively spread. Werther made an epoch because it appeared, not because it appeared at a certain time. There is in every period so much unexpressed sorrow, so much secret discontent and disgust for life, and in single individuals there are so many disagreements with the world, so many conflicts between their natures and civil regulations, that Werther would make an epoch even if it appeared today for the first time. You are quite right, said Goethe. It is on that account that the book to this day influences youth of a certain age, as it did formerly. It was scarcely necessary for me to deduce my own youthful dejection from the general influence of my time, and from the reading of a few English authors. Rather was it owing to individual and immediate circumstances, which touched me to the quick, and gave me a great deal of trouble, and indeed brought me into that frame of mind which produced Werther. I had lived, loved, and suffered much. That was it. On considering more closely the much talked of Werther period, we discover that it does not belong to the course of universal culture, but to the career of life in every individual, who, with an innate free natural instinct, must accommodate himself to the narrow limits of an antiquated world. Obstructed fortune, restrained activity, unfulfilled wishes are not the calamities of any particular time, but those of every individual man, and it would be bad indeed if everyone had not, once in his life, known a time when Werther seemed as if it had been written for him alone. End quote. Perhaps, then, the feeling of being set apart, of being the sensitive one, misunderstood by the world, the feeling of suffering uniquely from one's own passions, of being hemmed in by the rules of society, having your activity restrained, having your wishes unfulfilled, none of this is unique. The feelings expressed here in this book are by no means universal, but belong to everyone who possesses, as Goethe says, a free natural instinct. Everyone who has to accommodate himself to the narrow limits of an antiquated world. Goethe felt that way. Napoleon felt that way. Jerusalem felt that way. Many young people today feel this way. Now, Werther is being rediscovered because, as Goethe says, it's not simply an expression of a certain romantic period in history. It's not the product of an age. It's something that will appeal to someone at perhaps a certain age in life. But it is a dangerous thing for these feelings to attach themselves to the archetype of Napoleon, at least in the world of memes. For this simply recapitulates to that trope of a special destiny, which can be quite destructive to one's life when that destiny does not turn out as one hopes or plans. An aspiring Napoleon can easily become a Werther. Let us hope, then, that these sensitive types find a path that is more like the path of Goethe himself, and decide to use those passionate energies for art. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.